This is Chapter 11, Section 1, Part 2. So now we're looking into what actually happened with Mendel's experiments and what did he notice. So Mendel noticed that when looking at the F1 generation, so they have your parents. You have a tall plant and a small plant, but when you looked at the F1 generation, they're all tall. And they took the traits of only one of the parents, as so it seemed. One trait seemed to be hidden. So if we look at this one, there's not the small. So the small parent, somehow that gene was not expressed. And we'll come back and talk about what happened in the F2 generation in just a little bit. Genes and alleles. When looking at simple traits, they're often controlled by a single gene. And these genes are the chemical factors that will determine the traits. Each gene is made up of two alleles. So there's two alleles in that gene, one coming from the sperm and one coming from the egg. So we would expect two of them. However, when a trait is controlled by a single gene, dominance sometimes occurs. And the principle of dominance states that some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. This means if both alleles are present, whichever is the dominant allele, that is the trait that will appear. So if we go back here, again, we look at dominance. Obviously, the allele for tall, being tall, that is the dominant allele, and that's why in the F1 generation we only see the tall ones. But how about the next generation? So what happens to this trait that disappears, this short trait? Mendel didn't know what happened to it, so he decided, you know what, I'm going to continue to research and see what happens if I self-pollinate the plants from the F1 generation. So remember, the self-pollinating plants, he's going to pollinate them with themselves. So it's just going to have their alleles. And it's not going to get one from the mother, not going to get one from the father necessarily. It's going to take what it already has. This offspring he called the F2 generation. And this is where the recessive traits reappeared. So if we go back here, so again, we took these guys here, took one and said, you know what, I'm going to self-pollinate with it. So it's going to have its genes from itself. And this is where the recessive trait reappeared. So you had 3 tall offspring and 1 short offspring. So alleles from the parent were basically split into the reproductive cells. So we go back to that meiosis. So you have one parent now. We're not getting one from the mom, one from the dad. But now you're actually splitting that DNA, those chromosomes, apart. And so they can only pass one allele for a trait. So they're only giving one. And this is what we call the segregation of alleles. They're only getting one. So when we look at the tall versus short, in this F1, it must have gotten 2 from its parents, and now it's splitting those and giving 1 to each of its offspring. So the tall T, capital T, and the small t are the 2 possible alleles that can be passed on. So in 50% of the sex cells, it's going to have this tall T, it's going to be tall, the T allele, and in 50% of the sex cells, there's going to be the short allele is going to be present. So when we looked at this, so you have parents, we had that tall and short. 2 capital T's for tall, 2 S's, and this one for short. So what happened is you got this first offspring, and they were all tall, giving us this indicator that if they've got one from their mother and one from their father, they should each have a T and an S. This is why we get all of them that are going to be tall, because the tall T is the dominant one. However, when we look back as if we are self-pollinating these with one another and we look at their genetic makeup, down here you have the T and the S and the T and the S. Well, what happens then is when these combine as well, we end up getting 3 with a dominant, capital T, and one that doesn't have the capital T at all, showing us that in the F2 generation, we are going to see this recessive trait reappear. Let's go a little bit more into depth about this F1. So he crossed the F1 generation and the recessive trait reappeared in about 1 out of 4 plants. And this makes sense when we look at the crosses more in depth. Each parent plant will pass on one allele for any given trait. And if one of those is dominant, the recessive trait is going to disappear. Each individual from the F1 generation now has one dominant allele and one recessive. So if we go back here, this first generation is going to have one dominant, capital T, and one lowercase, the recessive. When those are now pollinated together, you get dominant and recessive, and we will likely have a 3-to-1 ratio in the F2 generation. And if we look back here, and this has to do with the fact of the combination. If the parents are each giving one of those to the offspring, there is that opportunity that we're going to get the recessive. And we're going to talk more about the math calculations in the next section. I have listed some resources on this site if you want to go a little bit more in depth, do some other different simulations. Those are there for you.